Good evening and good day. I'm calling in from New Zealand, so it's evening here, and obviously Pamela is in France, so she's calling in from France, and Emma is in London, I think, Emma. So today we're going to have a panel discussion around risk and the discipline of risk and how that impacts on organisational performance and culture and so forth. It promises to be a discussion as opposed to an endless line-up of slides and diagrams and so forth. So please, as we go through this morning, just if you've got questions, forward them through. Sue will be collating those and we'll get round to addressing those near the end of the discussion. But before we do that, I think it'd be a really good idea to introduce ourselves. So maybe if I kick off, just to give you an idea as to the perspective we're coming from as we're discussing risk and the discipline of risk and how it relates to culture and business performance. So I'm Mark Kidd. I'm one of the co-founders of Safe365. We are a digital SaaS business around the health and safety space and risk management. My background is predominantly around helping organisations build high-performing teams and cultures, and I've been fortunate enough over the years to be on executive teams and C-suites, and as a result of that, being fortunate enough to have risk people reporting to me and colleagues sitting on executive teams and through to on board. So I'll be approaching the discussion today from the perspective more from a business lens as opposed to a risk discipline. I'm not a risk expert or a safety expert, so my lens will be more from a business commercial lens in terms of the discussion this morning. I'm just wondering, Pamela or Emma, would you like to kick off next?
I don't mind. I'll go first. Good morning, everybody. Dr. Pamela Gately, as Sue said, the CEO of Healthcare RM. We're an integrated health risk management business, and so we straddle occupational health and safety, health benefits, and also well-being. And my particular focus, having come from a health and safety background, but it actually is understanding the personal risk factors and how human factors when we're looking at organisational risk, but also in terms of the controls that we actually develop to prevent and reduce those risks. That is where I've specialised in the last 10 years as we've assessed and looked at the data and how meaningful that is in terms of correlating with ill health such as musculoskeletal disorders and mental health. So you'll see my slant is very much coming from that perspective. Emma?
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. I'm Emma Stone from the Department of Management at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm an organisational psychologist. So I study people and organisations with a particular focus on looking at the connections between organisational environments, structures, processes, and the decisions that people make about risk. I think about what the consequences are for organisations in terms of the ways that they handle risk, and the ways that organisations are exposed to risk. And I teach those subjects as well to our executives and postgraduate students. I also have experience of working with many different organisations from the risk perspective, so for instance banks and healthcare, as well as a wide range of other organisations, public and private sector. And I also link that with the research and teaching that I do on leadership. I think what we'll talk about today creates a lot of linkages between the ways that we think about risk and the ways that we create structures and influence in organisations.
Cool. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Pamela. So to kickstart the conversation today, the topic is around risk and how this actually impacts on not just cultures and organisations, but actually business performance. And I think one of the observations that I'd make, if I could, is risk as a discipline is still a relatively new discipline, pretty much akin to health and safety and risk, and in a lot of ways there's joint overlap between those disciplines. But when you look at the evolution of different functions, whether it's finance or human resources or IT or whatever it is, I think you'll find that when you look at organizational structures and ways of being over the years, risk has had many different permutations and ways of being expressed in organizations. And I think when you look at it as a discipline, it's definitely a relatively new discipline, and a discipline that's gaining huge amounts of momentum. And so what we'd like to talk about today as a bit of a panel discussion is where does risk fit in terms of the organizational context? Where is it now? And equally, where the future of risk lies in terms of how it can have a positive impact on organizational performance, culture, and how it links into the whole commercial discipline as well. It is one of those areas which is deep in technical expertise, there's no doubt about that, but equally it has a huge impact on organisational performance. But before we do that, one of the things that Emma and Pamela and I were discussing was the different interpretations of risk, and what does that actually mean? Because it does have an impact on the way that risk is viewed by an organisation. In fact, the way that an organisation may actually use risk in its business to help it grow and think about the things it has to do to achieve organisational performance. So if I can just hand over to maybe Emma or Pamela in terms of those different interpretations of risk and your view on how you see that and how that can actually have an impact on the way it can potentially build an organisation's culture and the behaviours and the values in that culture.
Yeah, okay, I'll make a start with that. Thanks, Mark. It's a very interesting question. So we've got a number of layers that we can look at here. One is to say that people's personality creates a lens through which they see the world, and that changes how people see risk. So some of the research that we've done has shown that there is a profile for seeing risk, and people vary in the extent to which they will say, no way, too risky, I'm not comfortable, to let's go, an incredible opportunity. And what people are thinking about here is how can we gain the benefits that may accrue from engaging with risk, whereas we've also, of course, got the possibility of harm. So it's always about what are the benefits, what are the possible downsides that may materialise, and we vary in the extent to which we're comfortable with that. And that has different levels of effect depending on where you are in the organisation. So what we know from our research and from the studies of other people is that organisations can start to look like the profiles of the people in charge of them, and particularly when senior people have a lot of discretion. So for example, if a company is new, if it is heavily focused on something like research and development, which is quite a risky endeavour, if the CEO of an organisation is also the chair of the board, for example, what that means is they have a lot of discretion. So companies start to look like they do in all kinds of ways. And one of them is about the risk profile of the organisation. So people that are willing to engage with risk because they believe there are benefits in doing so, are more risk oriented in their strategy. And that's how we see companies reflecting the preferences of the people in charge. So that works at a company level, and what happens is that CEOs and senior people behave in certain ways, behaviours coalesce around them, we create norms, and they create culture. And this can happen throughout organisations, and of course the bigger an organisation, the more variability you may have. So you might have different profiles within large organisational functions where there is specialisation. So for example, we would expect to see some differences between a big organisation, for instance, in a research and development department, compared with people that are taking care of customers, for instance. So we can see a number of different ways there that interpretations shape people's views of risk, and the ways that, as I say, behaviours create norms and we then find culture can build around that, because what it's telling people is that these are the ways that we behave, this is what's acceptable, and this is not.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting concept, isn't it, Emma? I'd have to say, from personal experience, having been on the executive of a large banking organisation, inherently conservative, and when looking at any sort of decision at C-suite level, the first thing that would kick in is what's the downside? What potentially could go wrong? And then when you start to think about innovation and bringing new products and services to market, the first conversation would always be, what is the downside? It's almost like that glass empty approach to things. And given the nature of particularly, say, banking environments, and if you're in certain parts of the world, they're usually quite a finite market in terms of the number of players that exist in the market, then you can get the situation where risk is seen in high regard for obvious reasons, but equally because of the conservative nature and the personas that exist, not just in C-suite but also in the board, it can sometimes stifle innovation. And if I draw a comparison to Safe 365, the business that I'm in at the moment, we're very disruptive. And when we think about risk, we think about it with a totally different lens, and we're thinking about glass full, what's possible as opposed to what's not possible. And having worked in both environments, it without doubt, it has a different impact on the extent to which you think about things like products, services, innovation, the risk you're prepared to tolerate in order to get things done. Pamela, have you had similar experiences yourself in terms of the way that risk interrelates, I suppose, with the culture and the norms and the behaviours of an organisation?
Absolutely, and I think to support what Emma said, and looking at it in a slightly different view, although we've got occupational psychologists that work in our organisation as well, so a key role. But we take it at the individual level, because what organisations are worried about, there is always that safety culture and the risk of injury, risk of accidents. The big issue is that relating to the risk of ill health, and from our perspective, we see an awful lot of that come out in sickness absence for things like musculoskeletal disorders, and obviously the big one in recent years has been mental ill health. And often that link between risk and health and safety isn't always sort of connected. But one of the areas that came out in the sort of, well, it started in '77 by a chap called George Engel, was the whole concept of biopsychosocial model. And then in the 90s, there was the development of the psychosocial flags. And these very much with what Emma was saying, in the sense that there are red flags, which are serious. Pathology says somebody's got a serious medical condition, fine, we can actually sort of accept that. The same with an orange flag, which is a serious mental health condition. But when you see yellow flags, which are people's attitudes, beliefs, fears, that how they actually sort of look at risk, not only what their job is at work, but also how they look at it in terms of their personal lives, what they think about their medical condition, it can really change their behaviours on what they do, and it can actually be a maintenance factor and an obstacle to recovery from, you know, a lot of common conditions. But then the other issue that we see, which is quite a big one relating to work, is a blue flag. So blue flag is normally to do with, you know, people's working environment, their sort of pay, their benefits, their relationships with colleagues, and it links with sort of black flags. So things like sick pay benefits, private healthcare, all of the benefits that HR will actually put into an organisation could actually have an adverse reaction on somebody's recovery. But also, I think it's really important when you link to health and safety risk, and you put that whole health and safety and occupational health together, what you actually see by understanding these factors, which are very aligned to what Emma was actually talking about, then it actually changes what controls you need to put in place from a health and safety perspective to prevent these risks occurring, but also what you actually use when you manage them. And I think the interesting bit for me is that overlap between then things like health and safety, HR and ER, and all of the data that actually then comes out of this can actually go up to the C-suite, to the main board, and how they look at risk then can be very, very different to what the way in which they might approach it when it's looked at in isolation.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, you touched on a point there around, which is something dear to my heart, which is around data and insights. And an observation that I'd make more about the safety environment as which doubles over into risk, obviously, but it is around the use of data and insights. And I'd have to say I think one of the biggest challenges for the safety and risk profession at the moment, particularly when it comes to influencing C-suite around making really good targeted interventions to improve safety outcomes and improve workplace performance and harm in the workplace and so forth, is the use of data. And for example, we're with a national insurer today, as it turns out, and one of the things that they are really keen to focus more on is the ability to capture data, and it's safety data, risk data, and all the rest of it, and how that relates to not just an improvement in safety culture, but a reduction of harm in the workplace. And then how do you use that data to drive decisions around risk assessments on businesses, for argument's sake, as an insurer? And it's something that I think the profession can be a lot better at in terms of capturing data. And of course, there's the traditional lag data, and then there is the leading data, and there's varying degrees of views on that, it's fair to say, and it keeps vacillating between lag data is great and some people saying it's not. When you actually start to use leading and lagging data together to tell a story, and being able to capture that data and then produce it as insights that you can actually take to the executive and the board, then that starts to make safety and risk a lot more relevant to them in terms of a business context. And I think the challenge that we see out there in the marketplace is, and as part of the evolution of the risk and safety disciplines, there's no doubt about that, but it's actually being able to capture that data and capture it in a way that then can be turned into really valuable insights, which then can be shared with an executive and a board to help them understand exactly where the weaknesses are in the organisation and what they need to focus on in terms of the time, money and energy that they need to spend to actually improve outcomes from a continuous improvement point of view, and of course from an ROI point of view. And so I think one of the challenges for the profession is being, I think, a lot more discerning around that. And because what you're really starting to do then is turning safety and risk into a business language, as opposed to a safety language or a risk language. And so some of the challenges that we see often is safety or risk people going to the executive and saying all the right things around the safety and the risk impacts on the business, but sometimes there's a disconnect between the language that's used versus the business language and the way that C-suite and boards receive information. And one way to cut through that barrier is by using data, because data stops people, what I call stops people from making decisions in a fact-free zone. And sometimes it's the latest thing that someone may have read from a piece of research, and they go, we need to have learning teams, learning differently, team safety too, and all that stuff, which are all good stuff, don't get me wrong. But actually, when you start to use data, you can start to create greater informed decisions at C-suite level.
And it's real world data, I think, as well. So, sorry, Mark, but I think it's, to that point, I think it's real world data, because one of the things that you can actually do is, if you're collecting data and it's what's got us interested in the whole human factors and the personal risks, you can actually bring it into actually starting to bring safety and risk into a very close relationship with other disciplines such as HR, ER, pensions, incapacity, all of the different things that an organisation has, IT, technology, all actually sort of comes into this. But the data clearly can actually look at return on investments, and really good return on investments, but also not only return on investment, but the value on the investment and the return on the experience that you gain from that data. So I very much agree, you have to look at all data together, and looking at quantitative data and qualitative data, and then it can make a very meaningful sort of story that you can present to the C-suite, the main boards, then that they can make informed decisions on, as opposed to everything being in isolation. So Emma, sorry, over to you as well on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, you both made a very compelling case for the use of data there, and of course I agree totally. And I think the the quantitative and qualitative, as you said, inform. And I would like to pick up on a point you raised there, Mark, as well, about language. And I think this is really key. So when I study organisations, one of the things that I have found repeatedly is that there is no common language around risk. So on the one hand, we want something which is, a specialist, and it has depth. So for instance, if you have people, when you're looking at safety in the way that Pamela is, for instance, obviously we want things to be extremely specialist there and very focused on what to achieve. There is a bigger language around risk. And so what I see are a few interesting things. One is there isn't a common language. And as you highlighted, Mark, when people think about risk, they think, well, this is something we have to manage. And when we come to safety, of course, there's no debate about that. However, what's also important is what's the other side of that. And as I say, one of the things that I observe is organisations say they're conservative and they say we don't engage with risk. Actually, they're engaged with a lot of risk. And they do not have frameworks to actually understand the risks that they have exposed themselves to. So that bigger picture view about viewing organisations as creators of risk is one that I think could benefit from being embraced more, which is, how do we keep people safe? And how do we innovate? So as I say, what's quite common is people thinking that they're being conservative, whereas actually they have got risk exposure all over the organisation, yet it is not understood in a way that actually gives board members and the most senior managers oversight of what's happening, particularly when organisations get bigger.
Yeah, look, I'm glad you've raised that, Emma. Part of our product, we collect data. In fact, we have 800 million data points on our system. And one element of that, one module is around board governance. And it breaks it down into the board's understanding of health and safety and the board's understanding of risk and other things. And across the tens of thousands of businesses who use our product, the module that is the weakest, and this is quite staggering when you really think about it, the weakest part is around board governance, and it breaks it down into understanding of safety culture and understanding of risk. And if you believe, as I do, that cultures are created from the top, from the leadership sets the tone, the environment, the direction, and then it cascades through the organisation. One of the challenges that we see is that, according to our data, and then when you're engaging with C-suite, is if your board directors, for example, don't understand what good safety looks like and what good risk looks like, and they're in a governance role, that then cascades through the organisation into C-suite, the executive, and then right through the organisation. So that data set that we've captured over the last 7 or 8 years, unfortunately, it paints a picture where the leaders in the organisation actually have a very weak understanding about what the risk and safety disciplines actually look like. And you know, it's not necessarily any fault of theirs. You know, when you're sitting on a board, you're looking at the operational aspects of the business, the marketing, the revenue, the profitability. There's 1,001 things that you need to be across, and safety and risk is another. As important as it is, it's another thing that board directors and also C-suite need to be cognizant of. The really unfortunate thing from our data set is that it's actually the weakest of the 85 elements. And so when you start thinking about building really strong safety cultures and really strong cultures around risk, then unfortunately the skill set that exists or doesn't exist in this case at C-suite is actually absent in a lot of cases. Not in all cases, but that's what our data is telling us. And so what that creates in my mind is a real challenge for boards and C-suite around getting that understanding. You know, what are they required to know from a governance point of view, from an assurance point of view? What is their legal, moral, ethical responsibility around understanding that? And then how does that link to business performance and commercialization of your business in terms of profitability? And it is a weakness. We're in 42 countries around the world now, and it is consistently a theme across all of those. And it goes to what you're saying at the heart of that, Emma, which is around a common language. And what is that language? And is it in a language where C-suite can understand it, and when a risk or a safety person is communicating to C-suite, are they doing it in a language that can be received, or are they talking past each other? And I'm not sure whether you've had that experience, Emma, in some of your dealings. I know we have, and I think it's something that needs to be focused on. Is what is that common language? And yes, there are, you know, the ISO 45001 and other things that you can look to as a standard. And yes, we use that, and yes, it helps. But you know, is there a need for some form of universal language around the way that you communicate risk and safety so that everyone's on the same page, or is that too big a ask?
It is a big ask, isn't it? Well, I think there are several elements to this, of course. Safety, I think there's a lot more going on there because of the regulatory environment that organisations are working in. So that does give more of a common framework. And as we say, that is not an area that is contested in the same way that understanding risk is. Now, there are challenges, but there are some different forms of challenges. So I think with risk, yes, there might be elements of maturity as an area, as you started off by saying, Mark, in your introduction. I think it's also about creating interpretations in organisations. So when you said about interpretations of risk as the opening point, you know, we looked at individual differences, and those, of course, are important. What you also have is organisationally created narratives about risk, and what do they look like, and how do they evolve. And I think this is something where you said, what am I seeing? Not enough conversation about what we mean by risk is something that I observe commonly, and that people talk to me about. So here, one of the issues is that it is a conversation that people find a bit loaded, you know, that risk is something we have to pull down. And as I say, when we're talking about safety, that's absolutely the case. However, when we're talking about risk, it is about that openness. Yes, we are engaging with risk. We are doing something novel. We are setting out, you know, whether it's research and development, whether it's a strategic growth, whether it's going into an emerging market or a new product. Any of those kinds of issues, and then it's really having that kind of open discussion about it so that people can work together to construct their understanding of risks in organisations, because there will be very localised concerns as well within different divisions, within organisations, within markets, and I think being able to have a commonality and a subtlety becomes very important.
Yeah, some really good points there, Emma. Part of the work that we do is we do benchmarking across sectors, and So there's the health sector, the education sector, FMCG, local authorities, for example, and now with with obviously with Heathrow looking to do across airports. That to some extent is creating some degree of common language, in our case around safety culture. And I think that will help, and will help as part of the maturation process as this discipline gets more widely accepted inside the way organisations not just do everything else, but actually do their safety and risk. But it's still early days, and we go from organisation to organisation, as you can imagine, and the way they think about safety and risk varies considerably, and it's got a lot to do with the risk and complexity of the organisation. You take, say, Heathrow, for example, highly complex, risky organisation with 350 of some of the biggest UK and Europe and global businesses as their partners, hugely complex. And I think the cool thing with that is a common language is being created around how they think about Team Heathrow, which is what it is, which is super cool. But we can see when we're talking to people at Virgin versus Mace versus Ferrovial, the way they think about risk and safety is different. And hopefully interventions like that will start to create a common language, if you like. They'll still interpret it differently and do things differently, obviously, but there's starting to be a common language, and if you can create that common language and framework, then the data points that you're actually collecting become even stronger. And with those data points and those insights, particularly in an ecosystem, say like Heathrow, for example, 350 major employers sitting there all thinking about risk and safety in the same or a similar way. And so when you can grab that data, turn it into insights, then when you start talking about what can you do collectively together as an ecosystem to improve outcomes at a systemic level, and you've got the same language and the same way of thinking about risk and safety, I think that's when you're going to get major leap forwards in the way that you can put interventions in that can change things at a systemic level. And so I think that's part of the journey that we're observing out there at the moment. And the really cool thing about that is these organisations are up for it. That they want to work collaboratively. They want to invest their time, money, and energy on the things that really matter, and they're going to make a difference in terms of improving safety culture and reducing harm in the workplace. But there's still some way to go. There's no doubt about that. One of the common questions I get asked, and maybe this goes to the heart of some of this, is particularly from safety professionals, is why am I not sitting on the executive team? And I think I probably get asked that 2 or 3 times a week from different heads of safety who are exceptionally talented people who are really good at their craft, but slightly frustrated that they're not sitting on the executive team to then help the organisation understand safety and risk. I think that potentially is a challenge. The extent to which information, if they're reporting into a corporate services person or a legal person or whoever it might be, or the head of people and culture, the extent to which the information flows get filtered both up and down, and the potential impact that has not just on increasing the knowledge of C-suite and their understanding of safety and risk both up, but equally coming back down. So truly understanding what the actual problem is. And if you can't identify what the problem is, it's really hard to come up with a solution. But I wonder whether or not in organizational structures, safety and risk people sitting at tier 3 instead of tier 2 is having a material impact on the speed at which organizations and cultures are adapting to the importance of risk and safety in their environments.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was going to be the point that I picked up on, Mark. Yes. So, for example, if you see an organisational structure where the head of risk and safety is reporting into the head of, chief financial officer, then that tells you how risk and safety are viewed in the organisation. And here I think there is a broader view, which is, of course, we need specialists in this area, as well as an understanding that risk is everybody's business. So I think that what you say about the ecosystem, I agree with absolutely. And for that to have the impact that you would want to see, then it also is going to require changes within organisations. And of course, we're always looking at formal structures and informal structures. So formally, where do people sit? Whom do they report to? Do they get to go to board meetings and so on? And also informally, what is happening? Who are the conversations? Who are the boundary spanners in the organisations? These are the elements of work generally that tend to be overlooked, that tend not to be part of people's workload. But when somebody is in the role of risk and safety, of course, that kind of boundary spanning, that connecting with people across the organisation, laterally as well as up and down, becomes absolutely critical. And what is sometimes overlooked is the mechanisms. How does that happen? And is it recognised and rewarded? That's actually part of your job to do that. And again, that's something that we don't see very much of in organisations. So I think that's something where there could be change and it wouldn't be that difficult to achieve.
And I think there are some easy solutions to some of this as well, because we keep talking about safety and risk, and I agree that, you know, often health and safety and risk is often separated. I also agree with often they're not represented, and particularly in the larger organisations. But the larger organisations tend to understand, you know, what risk is a lot more than the sort of smaller organisations, and we have got a huge amount of SMEs across the globe, and certainly in the UK we've got an awful lot. But I think one of the bits, and I believe that in members of the audience today, there are people that are health and safety professionals, and yet we keep referring to safety and to risk. But with health and safety, that health element, some professionals will feel that it's not their role. Some people will, some will say they need to know more about it. But what the health encompasses is the risks of the people, and the bit that we need to take into account, not only into health and safety risks, but also the overall bigger piece of risk management and the human factors. And I think if you can actually start, again, going back to the data piece and starting looking at sharing that data and that information on the people, there normally is an HRD. There's somebody that sits on a main board or reports into a main board director that is responsible for the people. And health and safety is equally important to the people as it is to finance and everything else. And I think that's often what we keep missing, is we're ignoring that people element, because the people are so important in the culture. They're so important on whether accidents do or don't happen, but also, is it an occupational hazard which actually caused the illness to an individual, or is it the individual, or is it a combination of both? And I think it goes back to that data piece, Mark, is often we're not collecting sufficient data or the right data to actually present that data up to the C-suite and the main board, so people really understand this in its broadest sense. And that's why I think it often gets isolated, because it is a complex area, it is difficult, and a lot of people don't understand it. And therefore, I totally agree that when by the time it gets up to the main board, it might be diluted for different reasons. And I think we have got to work towards that, the risk management and health and safety professionals really being, you know, having a voice on that main board and that C-suite. So I could keep going on about it, but I'll stop there.
No, that's fine, Pamela. I mean, I think the structural side of it may well be helpful. I personally believe that you can demonstrate leadership irrespective of where you sit or inside an organisation, but it does require certain leadership skills and attributes to be able to do that on the individual's part. But equally, an understanding that from the individual that they need to be able to relate to the organisation if they are a safety and risk person, need to be able to relate in a way that they understand the business, they understand the whether it's products or services, who the market is, what the addressable market is, how the business makes its money, and a whole bunch of other things, whether it's in social good, not-for-profit, or whatever it might be. I think there's an onus on the safety and risk people to really understand the business. And if you understand the business and then relate it to your discipline, in this case being safety and risk, then I think that's when you start to get a connect. And the connect is usually going back to the language we mentioned before, Emma, it's usually in the language that's being used by the risk and safety professional when they're conversing with other internal stakeholders in the business. And I think that's when you start to galvanize and embed risk and safety more into your culture, because it has a direct line of sight with the organization in terms of commercial outcomes or social impact outcomes or ESG or whatever it might be. If professionals can better understand the business that the organization's in and connect it to the discipline, then I think that's where we're going to see quite a sea change in the way that risk and safety people are used inside an organisation, given that every organisation is at a different stage of maturity. One of the things that we touched on the other day talking about this, if you were looking at the things that I suppose tips, for want of a better word, but for embedding risk and safety into your culture, what would be the one of the big ones for you, Emma or Pamela, in terms of a tip that you could give the audience in terms of how do you embed that safety and risk into your culture? We've started talking about the use of data, the use of language, all of those things, but if there are other things that really spring to mind for you in terms of that journey.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so when we think about culture, we've got three elements. If we look at the classic work of Edgar Schein, we've got the assumptions that underpin what we do, our values and beliefs and our behaviours, and the other artefacts that we can see. So one of the things that I've been looking at recently in several organisations is problematizing. How do we challenge the existing assumptions? How do we think, encourage some different kind of thinking? And this kind of discussion, you can use it for any number of assumptions, but I think what do we assume about risks is a great starting point. So what's underlying the behaviours that we take as read, things that we just accept? Can we stop and think, why are we doing that? What are the risks that we're engaging with? If we think we are conservative, are we really? Or if we think we're taking a risk, what risk are we really taking? So this notion of challenge, right? We're all facing novel risks, things that we need to talk about, things that we need to interpret and make sense of. So this idea of problematizing, what are we actually about? What are we assuming here about? What is risk? What is safety? What do we mean by health? Now, that itself, what I've been finding, can become part of the culture of the organisation, because what you're assuming there is that risk is something that is complex and it needs to be understood carefully. And if we value those conversations, we will behave in those ways. So what you're doing is creating a culture from the bottom up by thinking about assumptions, values, and then behaviours. Now, we can then create a culture where we routinely problematize, we challenge each other, we have these kinds of open conversations. So that, I'm finding, is extremely effective in helping people to develop an understanding of risk as well as health and safety. I'm using risk in a broad sense there throughout an organisation. So what I'm finding is that really works. However, there is a caveat, which is there's a bit of be careful what you wish for there, because when people are empowered to have these conversations, it can take interpretation in very different directions. Now, this is where it might be the head of risk and safety alongside other people, which is, again, classic organizational function, coordination. How do we actually coordinate? And again, that's something that may be invisible in an org chart typically. So who has that role and what are they doing there? And again, this is where, as we have said, people who are responsible for health, risk and safety, that it is part of their role, and yet they might not have the latitude to do it. So really pushing there on the leadership and influence side, as you said, Mark, people can be leaders anywhere in the organisation, absolutely. So really, if you've got a mandate, amazing. If you haven't, keep pushing and thinking about the influence, so that you can actually have that role of really stimulating these kinds of open discussions throughout the organisation and coordinating them so that you create a view of risk as well as a mechanism for keeping talking about it.
Cool, awesome.
And I would agree with that, Emma, in terms of when we, and we're in a different situation to yourselves in terms of getting those organisational conversations going, but because we try to integrate disciplines and because we try and actually get people understanding each other's language and they're using data to actually support the conversations, then we actually find we can actually start asking those sort of difficult questions across the organisation. You do sometimes get the pushback that it's like, to your point of what you wish for, some people are going, I don't want to open that can of worms. And that's been particularly true from a psychological point of view, because there's been a lot of media saying, you know, that the harm is actually being caused by the organisation and the suggestion that it's the organisation's fault. And I still hear that an awful lot in the circles that I work with Business for Health and the APPG and the CBI. It is the organisation's fault. But actually, when you look and assess and actually look at the data, it's not necessarily the organisation's fault. It's a contribution of various sort of risk factors that actually come together to potentially cause that harm. And I think the beauty of having the conversations is you can actually identify things that actually you might go, oh, that is really, really interesting. But I'm concerned that often if we don't have those conversations and we don't get into the detail and we don't actually look at the data, then the control measures that we try and put in place within an organisation to reduce the risk or manage the risk could be missing some really important elements that are actually going to help reduce the harm to people. And I'm obviously focusing specifically on the people as opposed to the broader communities and the public at large. But I think so to me, I absolutely agree with all that. And I'm sorry, I kept losing my connection, so I've missed bits of the conversation as well. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Mark.
That's cool. Look, thank you, Pamela. An observation for you: when Safe 365 went to the UK for the first time before COVID, everyone we spoke to in the UK was absolutely fixated on compliance. Everyone was talking about compliance, and because our product is around safety culture and understanding how that is and what you can do about it. The sea change that's happened since COVID, which is really interesting, is everyone we're talking to in the UK is talking about safety culture, which is about, you know, changing the way the organisation thinks about its culture and capability and its performance. There's definitely been a sea change in the UK in terms of how businesses are thinking, which is really cool, because what that tells me is with that snapshot of effectively 3 years, something has happened in the maturation in the UK around what is perceived as being important. And I'm not saying compliance isn't important. I'm just saying it's moved much more to how can we understand our culture, our safety culture, our risk culture? Where are we at now? Where are the gaps in that? And then what do we have to do to actually address those gaps by putting in the right strategy, programs of work, allocating resources? It is a fundamental shift in the way that businesses, particularly in the UK, are thinking about the whole equation around safety and risk, which is just an observation for you. Really cool for us, because you know, we fundamentally believe in leading indicators and moving organisations along in terms of engaging the various stakeholders within the organisation. So a fundamental change there. Now I'm just conscious of time, and I should have actually checked in with Sue to see if there was any questions coming through. I'll just do that now, just to find out from Sue. But while Sue's jumping in, just for the panel, just if we had a crystal ball, and you were to look at safety and risk, and now in the future, what would be the 1 or 2 observations that you would make around risk and safety in terms of its natural evolution and where it's going to next. But I'll just pass back to Sue just to check in with Sue, if I can.
Yeah, we've got loads of questions, Mark. Just on the last part of your discussion, is that obviously the discussion that we've had this morning shows that risk is a very complex thing within organisations. So how do we make sure we're making the right informed decisions in light of this complexity?
Yeah, look, I think it goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about around that common language, a framework, a methodology, that everyone is, you think about ISO, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of ISO, and all it does some great stuff. But if in the absence of having some sort of framework or standard or a reference point, so for example, we're working with about 50 heads of safety in the UK around developing a wellbeing product using our dashboard, and the reference point for us is 45,003. And when you have all of those 50 heads of safety in the room at Amazon and soon again in Meta, that was their reference point in terms of providing a common language so that at least you can start from a baseline and you can reference to that baseline. And I think if there is that standardized framework, methodology, point of reference, then I think it's going to make it a lot easier in terms of how people think about risk and safety. Emma, you'll have a view on this.
Yes, I think this is a great question. And here I'd just say it's not necessarily, Pamela can talk to the health and the safety part, but I think for risk, it's not that there's a right option. It's what do you want to achieve by engaging with risk, and do you really understand what you're doing? So this could be a question of strategy. Is this something around strategic goals? Is it something around the objectives you have? All our decisions are oriented around some form of goal. The question for organisations is, do we really know where we're going? Is that contested? Have we been open about it? And often the answers to those questions are, well, actually, we don't agree on where we're going, or we haven't actually made transparent our thinking about it. We haven't surfaced it because we haven't had those conversations. So I'd say shift the conversation from what's right to what is it that we really want to achieve here? Do we know what we're about? And can we change if need be? If the information changes, if the situation changes, can we change what we're doing as well?
And I would simply say, to add to all of that, if you're collecting good data, the data will actually help direct you. It will help simplify the understanding of risk, but also it will help give you an idea, are you actually going in the right direction, or not? Do you need to sort of change? So I think data is critical and key to reducing the complexity of health and safety and also risk management.
Okay, thank you. Right, another question that has come through is, this person is stating that we often think of risk, health and safety as very separate entities. So how do we truly integrate them?
We had that discussion yesterday, didn't we, Mark?
Yeah, we did. And one of the observations I'd make with a number of our clients is they are now merging the two together, both safety and risk, because they can see the relationship between the two. I think that's really healthy, because the two overlapping disciplines, you can't think about safety without thinking about risk. And sure, risk is wider in terms of organisational risk. There's no doubt about that, but a subset of that is definitely safety. And so the two go hand in glove for me. So I think that's starting to happen naturally, as bearing in mind safety and risk are relatively young disciplines when you think about organisational performance over years, but it's now starting to merge that way naturally through the mere fact that organisations and the way people in them think about safety and risk has actually matured over time.
Yeah, and in doing so, the function can become an enabler of business, because sometimes when people think, oh, health and safety, it's stopping us doing things. I know that's a very kind of stereotypical view. However, it's how do we do things that we want to achieve in a way that is safe and is reasonable. So seeing the function as an enabler is important too.
Yeah, and I think health and safety, because it's been around longer, and there's lots of legislation behind health and safety, I think risk management can help change the language so it's more understood by a lot of people. So I think they definitely should be integrated without a shadow of doubt. But I keep saying, we keep talking about safety and risk management, we must include that health aspect as well. So Sue, I know you've got more.
Yeah, well, 4 questions. So this is somebody picking up on something that you mentioned, Pamela, about personal risk factors. And they said that the question is, how do they ensure that those personal risk factors are built into their overall risk strategy?
And I think it is about whether it is looking at it from a health and safety perspective, or any area of business that you're actually looking at, is actually start assessing those risks. So if you take the health and safety executive, it's identify the occupational hazards and who can be harmed and how. A lot of people, when they're looking at physical risks, will actually take things like age and gender, for example, into account. But we need to add to that, and things like looking at somebody's age and gender, their ethnicity, whether they're exercising, whether they're overweight. We have to look at those risks and not be frightened of them. When it comes to psychological risks, it's a little bit more difficult because they're not always as apparent as the physical risks, but it is very, very similar in the way. If you look at age, gender, ethnicity, you look at things like activity, excess weight, whether people are sleeping, you could work with your occupational health departments or your wellbeing divisions. But I think it is to actually accept that the people are part of the work that we are actually doing. You can't exclude them unless, we go to everything which is mechanical. So they are part of that risk. And I think it is about being brave to start assessing those risks, work with HR, work with OH. If you have them, if it's SMEs, it's a little bit sort of more difficult, but you'll actually identify by assessing those risks and making it very positive for the individual. It has to be a positive journey. They will start understanding, and we'll be educating individuals as we go along the way. So I hope that answers the question, but I'm also quite happy to talk to any individual about how to do it in a lot more detail with a lot more time.
Thank you. Next question then is really about this person saying that sometimes when they go into meetings and they talk about health, safety and risk, it's rather a staid and rather a sort of bland topic to talk about. So how do they start to think about things more innovatively to get people more excited about it, and to get more people engaged with the functionality that they've got within their organisation?
To me, and I've got a colleague that's helped us support this, make your data sexy. Because it really is, if you're actually pulling your sort of data, instead of using, and we've gone back, this is going back to the language again, instead of just using that traditional boring sort of health and safety risk management language, look at what and how you're actually presenting it and making it sexy. And if you bring it into real world and how it's affecting the business, their reputational risk, their people, and bring it to life. And I think you can actually do that by changing the way you take what can be quite boring health and safety information and change it into a very different presentational style that is actually then going to get your notice. And I think if you start talking about people and risk, and we should include in this the whole DE&I agenda within this, make it on point, make it what these people actually sort of want to hear. And it can make a huge difference. And I've got a colleague who does this superbly for the work that we do, because we have to present to main boards, to C-suites, to our customers, and it's bringing it alive for them, and it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think we can also add to that, which is a meeting is only one part of the role, and what are you doing? That's a crunch point, but it's also about actually how much opportunity have you had to understand the business and speak the language of the people that you're working with. So what happens outside of that kind of environment? Do you have opportunities, or can you create opportunities to actually speak with people and understand what they need from you in your role, and think about those kinds of relational techniques, but also the influence and leadership techniques that you can bring throughout, not just in meetings, but so that you're building up that influence by talking with people. And again, that's what I mentioned before with the organizational structure point, which is it might be hard to do that because it is not always part of your job to get out and talk to people in those ways. So it might be that sometimes you need to take additional time, at least initially, to spend time working with people to really understand their elements of the business, so that when you're communicating, you're really using their language and you're showing how what you're doing helps their elements of the business.
Yeah, look, it really does depend on the personas that you're referring to, whether it's frontline staff or C-suite. I know in our dealings with C-suite, when you start turning safety into a business language, and you can use, to your point, Pamela, data and insights, and you can show that, with a number of our case studies that we've done, that with the national insurer today, we were giving them some real life case studies around one organisation improved their safety culture by 12%, reduced their harm and injury by 40%, and the bottom line impact to that organisation was X. And the work we're doing with Heathrow can show the relationship between improving your safety culture and reducing your harm. The safety summit we had in November last year with the 350 CEOs, for example, you could have heard a pin drop. And so when you're starting to talk about engagement and getting people excited about that, we're talking about safety. And in that room were all these CEOs, and we were putting up data and insights, which was drawing the link between their investment of time, money, and energy into programs of work that could improve safety, culture, and outcomes and performance, and an improvement in injury and harm in the workplace. And you could hear a pin drop. And that workshop went on for 4.5 hours, and you had CEOs getting up and talking about the impact that it had on their culture and their performance and how critical it was. It's a different conversation. It's a commercial conversation which includes safety and risk, but it's presented in a way that makes it real for them at a C-suite level. Totally a different conversation with frontline workers and a different engagement and material that you'd use. But I think that for me, if I was looking at the crystal ball I mentioned before, for me, and I've touched on it earlier on, the crystal ball for me is safety and risk people getting a better understanding of commercial drivers and how businesses work, and then relating that to safety and risk and how the two interconnect with each other to drive commercial outcomes. I think when you start thinking about safety and risk in that way, particularly at C-suite and board level, the level of engagement and the use of those disciplines in the organisation will increase tenfold. We've seen it. It happens. It's achievable. It just means possibly a bit more application in terms of understanding wider commercial disciplines for safety and risk people, but it opens up the door for conversations that potentially may have been slightly ajar before. It completely opens it when you bring a commercial lens to it. That would be my crystal ball.
So do we need to, in terms of questions, do we need, maybe if there's a lot more, do we need to actually think about putting responses to those questions in a document?
It's okay. I think that covers all of the questions. I've conflated some of them down into few. That covers all the questions that have come through at the moment.
Yeah. So my crystal ball, and I know I'm going to be biased, Mark, but I think we really are going to stay. I think we're going to see the risk management with health and safety coming together, but I really think we're actually going to start seeing a broader understanding of the health aspects and the human factors actually coming into piece, because I think we're actually seeing, as you start presenting the data, we see that not just health and safety professionals, but the whole gambit of people that are involved in organisations taking more of an interest and changing that language. So I think the future is going to be more, how long it will take, I don't know, but a more rounded approach to health and safety and risk management, more as an integrated whole.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. So I'm going to add something slightly different, which is what I would like to see in addition to what you have said about the integrated approach, and that is more education on these points. So we create societies that have a deeper understanding of the concepts of risk and safety, and that this is education that it's never too early to start, because people come into people make all kinds of life decisions, and people come into organisations often without having really thought about these issues in a very structured fashion before. And I think we could gain so much if this understanding can ripple out, beyond organisations, to think about more broadly societal issues, because as we know, risks and safety and health issues are not bounded by organisations, they go far beyond that. So if we could add alongside a greater understanding of people and mechanisms for delivering that, then I think it would be incredible in terms of helping integration and in terms of helping people to make their own choices.
That's super. Thank you so much. Mark, have you got anything else to add before I wrap up?
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Sue, for organising the panel discussion today, and hopefully those folks tuning in have extracted some value from that. Yeah, it's been a great opportunity. So thank you very much, Sue, and to RSM for hosting the event.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you to all three of you for being involved, for sharing your knowledge and having such an informative discussion. So I think it's brought up a lot of different questions from those that are attending today. So that's great. Just for people that are watching, the recording will be on the IIRSM Resource Hub later on today, so you'll be able to recap or catch up in your own time. So I think we'll end the webinar here. Thank you ever so much for your inputs this morning and this evening for you, Mark. And thank you everybody that's joined us today. Hope you have a great day, and we hope to see you again shortly at the next IIRSM webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Emma.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.